this is the road from the cottage, they pulled straight into the cemetery road and parked. And so Look thought that they were lost. He gets out of his car then and starts walking toward the vehicle. He was 25 to 30 feet away when the car started backing up toward him. So he's gone past the curve, but then sees them park. And so he gets out, starts walking toward them, pale lights showing all over the uniform that he was wearing. Look believed the driver must have seen him as the lights glanced off of his badge and a whistle on his shirt. He started to call out an offer of help, but the car took off down Dyke Road in a cloud of dust. Hello, you guys. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell. We are currently working through Chappaquiddick. This is Leo Damore's careful, evidence-based piecing together of the story of what happened with Ted Kennedy in Chappaquiddick in 1969 that resulted in the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. Also, the very next video that I'm planning to release is Radium Girls, episode 1. So this is going to be a great book, totally different era, World War I era, young ladies in the workforce in a situation that resulted in workplace laws to protect workers. So I'm looking forward to that. I hope you'll join me for it. Please check out those additional videos. Make sure you're subscribed. And if you're new to the channel, I hope to earn your subscription today. Let's go ahead and get into Chappaquiddick. We are on chapter 15, and I'm going to try to get right through quite a number of chapters today, as many as we can do, so let's get going. Shortly after Inspector Herbert Burr came on duty in the radio room at Registry headquarters on Sunday morning, he received a call to see if he could find a license for Edward M. Kennedy. He found no record in the files, so he goes to the tab room. The tab room was where licenses would be key punched on IBM cards that were attached to perforated renewal forms. Okay, so the form and the card were attached. They were perforated together. This process normally took 2 to 6 weeks, and so sometimes things would be stuck in the tab room before they made it to the files. There were all yellow renewal cards there, he said. Among them was a license in the name of Edward M. Kennedy, valid until February 22nd, 1971. Burr had on some other occasions found licenses that had been in the tab room for some time, but never for 5 months. So it was a 2-year extension of a license. And so it would have been there since February, he's thinking. And so to sit there from February to July would be unheard of. He said sometimes it would take 2 to 6 weeks for something to go through the box and then make its way to the file room. But this one that's suddenly there on Sunday morning is a 5-month-old punch card. He couldn't explain the anomaly in the report on the license check. But all they care about in Chappaquiddick area is just that there is a valid license. And so having received confirmation of a valid license, Inspector George Red Kennedy went to the Edgartown police station accompanied by Joseph Grealish. Grealish delivers the license number and expiration date to Arena. What I want to point out is that this seems like a fix. Do you remember us talking about that they knew a guy who for $200 could take care of your license problem for you? They can't call that guy, but they call Joseph Grealish. He is a Kennedy man, and he is the one completing this delivery of a license number. And Inspector Herbert Burr has found this perforated form for a license that supposedly has been sitting there for 5 months, but that was not there previously. Well, all Chief Arena needed to complete his citation was that license number. And so he completes it. He sends it by mail to Ted Kennedy in Hyannisport. By doing so, Arena was not following standard police procedure. Normally, these tickets were delivered in person. That he was seeking to prosecute the senator for leaving the scene of an accident after causing personal injury marked the end of his investigation, he told a dozen reporters. From his examination of the accident scene, he was, quote, firmly convinced, he says, that there was no criminal negligence. Quote, but in the matter of the time period after the accident, there is, in my eyes, a violation concerning going from the scene, leaving the scene. In response to the amount of time that was waited between the accident and when it was reported, he said, quote, if he sat in his house for 5 minutes without reporting the accident, he was in violation of the law. That any delay at all is really in violation of the law. So Chief Arena's right on that point, but I don't think that a 5-minute violation of, oh, what just happened, going to get a Band-Aid in your head and then realizing, oh, I've got to run and report this thing, would be held in contempt of the law. I think the 10 hours is a bigger deal, obviously. Well, reporters wanted to know if Arena had looked into the possibility that the accident was related to drinking at a party prior to Ted Kennedy driving off Dyke Bridge. Having been deceived about the party, Arena had not asked that question of the senator. There was no other physical evidence at the scene that there might have been drinking, he said. I'm not pursuing that line at all. I'm still standing on the fact that there was no negligence. I really believe the accident is strictly accidental. This seems like willful belief. This is not... I mean, he himself was pretty angry about not having known about the party. And yeah, it's all been cleaned up, so there's no evidence. But for him to say, I really believe, I'm standing on the fact that there was no negligence, well, it's not a fact necessarily. I mean, a fact has to be proven in some way, and he's not got a fact. And then I really believe the accident. Well, okay, you can really believe anything you want, but that doesn't make it true. This is his police interview with reporters. And there ought to be more here than just kind of his conjecture. Here's what he went on to say. I'm firmly convinced the senator told me the correct story. He impresses me as a senator and as a man who would tell the truth. I think the senator was more cooperative with me because he released a statement more openly than most citizens might. Reporters liked Arena because he was pleasant and accessible, but the consensus was that Arena seemed incapable of hanging a rap on Ted Kennedy, more serious than just a misdemeanor traffic violation. Get this, y'all. Arena thought the case so wrapped up, he had even disposed of the original police report. Quote, it wasn't in Kennedy's handwriting, so I copied it and threw it away. His original typed police report. Weeks later, Carmen Salvador, remember the lady who was fielding the phone calls all day when it first happened? She admitted that she had fished the documents from a wastebasket to keep as a souvenir. Wow. Arena demanded that the statement be returned. Quote, I felt it would be good for my files because I figured I'm the one guy that's going to get questioned about this thing for the rest of my life. Suddenly you're thinking about that? You just threw it away. Then listen to this. Even after it had been returned, the document proved elusive. Quote, the truth is, one page of the damn thing did disappear again, he said. I don't know where the hell it went. I mean, is it that somebody's breaking in and doing this? Because he originally threw the first one away. Or is it that he just is kind of slowly getting rid of some of the evidence, making it harder and harder to find original copies? That's what it looks like. I mean, it looks suspicious, Chief Arena. Looks suspicious. Well, a reporter from a Boston paper said, Chief, you better talk to Huck Look. Arena had neglected to question the deputy sheriff in the confusion of events on Sunday. He had not forgotten. Look had tried to talk to him, if we remember properly, like I think 3 different times. At least 2 before he talks to Ted Kennedy. Twice, Huck Look has tried to tell what he saw. And it's not until later that evening that he kind of does, but it still hasn't been an actual, like, well, tell me everything you got. Give me what you got. Okay. So, Look's comments at Dyke Bridge hadn't seemed critical to him. Whether the accident occurred at 11:15, as Kennedy had said, or after Look saw the car, didn't make much difference insofar as leaving the scene of the accident charge was concerned. I mean, Yeah, technically that's true, that either way you left the accident, whether it was 8 hours of delayed reporting or 10 hours of delayed reporting, either way, you're at fault, right? But I mean, it definitely calls his truthfulness and his helpfulness. And what did he say? He's a man who would tell the truth. He was very cooperative and released a statement openly. It would call all of that into question if you've got a guy who's already kind of dickering about what time it happened. A husky man with the high color of the outdoors and a plain-spoken country boy manner, Look was reluctant to retell his story officially for the record, in view of the senator's published account of the accident. Look regretted having blurted out information before he realized its significance. Look had seen a dark car between 12:40 a.m. and 12:45 a.m. Saturday morning approaching the bend on Chappaquiddick Road. I'll put up the map so you can see roughly. It would be there in the middle. It's at the intersection of Dyke Road is where he saw this car. He says at the center. Arena noted, quote, he is positive there was a man driving and that there was someone next to him. He thinks there may have been someone in the back seat, but he's not sure. The car appeared, quote, unsure or lost, end quote. Look stopped down and started to walk toward the car, but the driver had sped off down Dyke Road. Arena says the thing that bothered me was that Huck was so adamant about his time. I did believe that he saw this particular thing, but I was between a stone and a hard place because I couldn't disprove Kennedy's time. Look gets questioned by George Killen and Bernie Flynn when these two detectives arrive at Edgartown. It says they made a formidable pair, that Flynn was very tenacious and was kind of like a tough street cop, and Killen was pretty rigidly principled. He was sincere and taciturn, and so the two together made quite a pair for investigating. But over 2 years of working together, while they hadn't initially liked each other, they had developed mutual respect and admiration, and they trusted each other. Killen knew that Huck Look was a reliable and responsible court officer from cases he had prosecuted at Edgartown. Look had worked as a special police officer at the Edgartown Yacht Club regatta dance from 8 o'clock to 12:30 on Friday night. This is super important so that it establishes the time that he saw the vehicle. It's not questionable. It's not a little bit adjustable. You know, I had the perspective, well, maybe Huck Look had been out kind of, patrolling, and the time might have been in flux a little bit. Maybe it has 15 or 20 minutes of give to it. It does not. He worked at the dance from 8 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. that very night. He was brought to Chappaquiddick in the yacht club's launch, and so he got into his car parked at the landing and headed home. So let's make sure we understand this. He's gotten dropped off at the ferry landing by the yacht club folks. His car was parked right there, right near that little shack where the next morning Ted's making his call. His car is parked there, and so he drives back from the landing. So we're talking about the dance end at 12:30. He's got a boat ride across. Whatever time that boat ride takes, that's where the flex in time is. So it could be any time after 12:40, but it can't be before because the dance didn't end until 12:30. Okay. He had seen the headlights of a car coming toward him near the curve at the intersection. Knowing the road, I slowed down because there's a sharp corner that people usually will cut too close, he said. I wanted to make sure I didn't get sideswiped. Look came almost to a complete stop, and a black sedan passed in front of his headlights. So there it is, it's going. There was a man driving, a woman in the front seat, and either another person or some clothing, a sweater, or a pocketbook in the back seat, what appeared to be a shadow of some kind. The car went off the pavement into the private dirt cemetery road. By this time, Look had proceeded around the corner a little bit. I observed in my rearview mirror that the car was parked, and it looked like they are going to back up. I thought that they wanted information, that they were lost or something. So just to get clear on the map right now, he was here. This is where he was dropped off. When he comes up, he sees headlights coming toward him. I'm guessing he's seeing headlights here, the headlights approaching here. So he comes almost to an exact stop. The car passes in front of him. This straight ahead, where Dyke Road goes to the right, the ferry landing goes to the left. So the cottage is right here. This is the road from the cottage. They pulled straight into the cemetery road and parked. And so Look thought that they were lost. And he gets out of his car then and starts walking toward the vehicle. He was 25 to 30 feet away when the car started backing up toward him. So let's picture that, backing up toward him. So he's gone past the curve, but then sees them park. And so he gets out, starts walking toward them, but then tail lights showing all over the uniform that he was wearing. Look believed the driver must have seen him as the lights glanced off of his badge and a whistle on his shirt. He started to call out an offer of help, but the car took off down Dyke Road in a cloud of dust. So it went this direction. He observed a Massachusetts registration letter, L, he said, and I did sort of a photostatic thing in my mind that it had 7s in it, at the beginning and at the end. He went back to his car, and a short distance from the intersection, he saw 2 women and a man doing a snake dance down the middle of the road like a conga line. Okay, they're dun, 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 dun. They're doing their little snake dance down the middle of the road like a conga line. He stopped to ask if they needed a lift, and the tall girl of the trio said, "Shove off, buddy, we're not pickups." The man in the group apologized. "Thank you, no. We're just going over there to our house." So there's a woman, a tall girl, and a man in this little group. Look mentioned the lost car to his wife when he got home at 1 o'clock. "I figured it was a man and a wife arguing about what direction to go. That's the first thing that came to my mind," he said, because he lived on Chappie at that time. So he gets home. Look wondered where the car was headed at that time of night because there weren't many places to go on Chappaquiddick once the ferry stopped running. But because he was giving his story without any guile or hesitation or calculation involved, there's nothing where it goes, "Well, I was about out for this length of time." It's like, they dropped me off immediately after the dance. The dance ended at 12:30. I just came down that short road and there they were. So we're definitely talking about 12:40 to 12:45. It could go later. It can't go earlier. Look's story was in clear contradiction of Senator Kennedy's report about the time the accident had occurred and the wrong turn he had said he had made at the intersection. So yeah, there's no wrong turn if you pull forward, park, and then back up and book it out of there. If it was Kennedy's car, and every indication is that it was Kennedy's car, to make a wrong turn, the driver would have had to ignore a directional arrow of luminized glass pointing to the left at that turn, the banking of the pavement to accommodate that sharp curve, the white line down the center of the road that keeps you going toward the ferry. And to accomplish such a maneuver, a driver would also need to slow to a stop to make an abrupt 90-degree turn onto the unmistakable, jarring ruts of Dyke Road. A buckboard ride Flynn and Killen endured on their way to take a look at Dyke Bridge, no more than a frail platform standing over Poocha Pond. So the road is not very sturdy. The bridge we're talking about, it says, is more like a frail platform. It's not some sturdy concrete situation. Dyke House was so close to that bridge, Flynn observes, there's no way you could go down that road and not see that house. It stuck out like a sore thumb, he said. Diagonally across from Dyke House, yet another residence was clearly visible from the road. Flynn counted 2 more houses that Senator Kennedy had passed when he had returned to the cottage after plunging into the pool. Flynn and Killen, these two detectives, walk the same path that Ted Kennedy would have had to have walked on his way back. They see Dyke House. They see another house diagonally across. It says that they counted 2 more houses Senator Kennedy had passed when he returned to the cottage after plunging into the pond. It took them 23 minutes to walk the 1.2 miles from the bridge to the cottage. That little weathered cedar shingled house was only 150 yards from the Chappaquiddick volunteer fire station. A red bulb burned inside the station and had a siren attached that would have easily woken all the residents if need be. It says, had the alarm been sounded, I would have been there in 3 minutes. And my volunteers and half the people on the island would have shown up within 15 minutes, Fire Captain Foster Silva says. Sidney Lawrence of Scarsdale, New York, was the owner of Lawrence Cottage. When he learned about the accident, Lawrence immediately went down to Edgartown and inspected the place on Saturday night. He found it swept clean of any evidence that a party had been held there. Lawrence told Silva, "They were real cute about that. I only found 8 empty Coke bottles. Even the trash barrels had been emptied." So that's the cottage owner's point of view. Well, Silva, this fire captain, lived 100 yards from the cottage. He was right there, and he had no trouble remembering the party. He had watched TV until 10 p.m. when his dogs started barking, and he went outside and saw 2 or 3 cars at the Lawrence house, he says. Quote, "There was a lot of singing and laughing coming from the house. I would say it was just a normal cocktail party. They were damn loud, though." Silva went to bed around midnight, but he couldn't sleep with all the noise the dogs were making because of the party next door. Silva thought that the revelers were being inconsiderate in not lowering their voices after 11 p.m. By 1 o'clock, he says, I was pretty well damn fed up with the whole thing. It was a damn farce at that hour in the morning. If they had kept it up any longer, I would have called the police. Silva's son-in-law also describes the party as, quote, one of those loud, noisy brawls put on by summer people. So you can see the attitude of the locals, that there's the everyday people, you know, we've got our normal routines, and then there's the summer people. In any kind of situation like that, that's the rub, is the fact that there's summer people often is why you have your job or why your kids have their jobs or whatever. There's extra money to be made because of the tourists. And yet, there are these complications that are irritating when you're just a person who normally enjoys the quiet of the island. But for some number of months, there's all of these tourists and all of this loud activity. The son-in-law says there was yelling, music, and general sounds of hell raising. The talk and laughter continued until 1:30 a.m. and then quieted down. Silva's wife, Dodie, said you could still hear people talking, but the noise level wasn't so bad. It was still going on when I went to bed at 2:30 a.m. Silva hadn't known that Senator Kennedy was at the party until the next morning as the car is being hoisted out. His wife recognized the automobile immediately. She said she had noticed the car go by several times that afternoon, driven by a middle-aged man with gray hair. I saw the same man driving the car after 9 o'clock in the evening. He was heading toward the ferry. So the same man, that would be the person that Rosemary went across to get the radio with. So was Charles Treader a white-haired man? That's what I would want to know. Flynn was surprised at the modesty of the premises that had been hired for a Kennedy party. He thought this was a simple little knotty pine living roomed cottage. It was tiny. It had simple furnishings. We're told about, a 9x12 Sears and Roebuck carpet that filled the living room's entire floor space. A blanket is rolled up at the end of the bed. It says it was all so neat that Flynn wondered if anything had even been slept in. Flynn and Killen took their place in the line of automobiles now waiting to board the ferry. As you can imagine, there were visitors flocking out to the island. The traffic broke all previous records by more than 100 cars. The owner-operator, Jared Grant, said that he had taken Senator Kennedy and a man he didn't know to Chappaquiddick around 6:30 p.m. on Friday night. He had operated the ferry until 12:45 a.m. when he made his last run to Chappaquiddick. So that's interesting. That's around the time that Huck Look would have been getting back. So I wonder which thing happened first or if either of them saw the other. He says he puttered around for another half hour. It was too hot to sleep that night. That fits. It was a beautiful night, very calm, and the water was like glass. He closed down at 1:20 a.m. He said he didn't recall taking Senator Kennedy to Edgartown. I was dead certain I didn't bring him back until I got to reading the papers, and then I wasn't so sure. The ferry could be summoned at any hour, he explained. We come out for any legitimate reason. It doesn't have to be a case of accident or injury. If you call, we'll come out. So this chapter wraps up with the theory of Bernie Flynn, which you'll want to listen to. This will interest many of you. It says, here's his scenario for the accident that he had put together by the time he disembarks from the On Time. I figure we got a drunk driver, Ted Kennedy. He's with this girl. He has it in his mind to go down to the beach and make love to her. Probably driving too fast, misses the curve, goes on to Cemetery Road. He's backing out when he sees this guy in uniform coming toward him. That's panic for the average driver who's been drinking. But here's a U.S. senator about to get tagged for driving under. He doesn't want to get caught with a girl in his car on a deserted road late at night and driving drunk on top of it. In his mind, the most important thing is to get away from the situation. He takes off down the road. He's probably looking in the rearview mirror to see if this cop is following him. He doesn't even see the effing bridge, and bingo, he goes off. He gets out of the car. She doesn't. The poor SOB doesn't know what to do. He's thinking, I want to get back to my house, to my friends, which is a common reaction. There are houses on Dyke Road he could have gone to report the accident, but he doesn't want to, because that's the same situation he was trying to get away from at the corner, which turns out to be a minor thing compared to what happened later. Now there's been an accident, and the girl's probably dead. All the more reason not to go banging on someone's door in the middle of the night and admit what he was doing. He doesn't want to reveal himself. The crowning irony is Teddy Kennedy was running from nothing. Huck Look couldn't have made an arrest even if he wished to. He didn't have the authority. You're only a special police officer at the place you're assigned, so he had been assigned at the regatta. Kennedy doesn't know that. All he knows is some guy in a uniform is coming after him. And the funny part about it is Huck is only trying to help him find his direction. That is ironic. Chapter 15 observations are, there is all of a sudden now a license for Ted Kennedy in the tab room where they get created. So Arena completes his citation. Now he seems determined to go as easy as possible on Ted Kennedy, as far as I can tell. He even threw away the original report. Isn't that weird? We get Look's exact story, finally. And Killen and Flynn walk the distance, and they note the number of houses and the amount of time it would take. We get Captain Silva and his son-in-law and his wife's observations firsthand about the party, the noise level. They're 100 yards from the cottage. That's a football field away. Get the ferry operator's point of view. Jared Grant is his name. And Bernie Flynn's theory seems very plausible to me. What do you guys think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Is that how you think it went? I know some of you think that he sped off, stopped, he got out, Mary Jo scooted over, and she's the one who went off the bridge. But Bernie Flynn's theory, at least the thinking of it, makes sense to me. What about you? Chapter 16. Killen didn't mention Flynn's theory when he reported to Edmund Dennis, which... Y'all, this is episode 7, but I've realized I was listening to a contemporaneous report. His name is Denise, Edmund Denise. So I'm going to try to change the way I'm saying that. Even though I know it's in the middle of the story, I do want to be factually accurate, but I'm sorry. I just apologize from the front that his name is Dinis. And so I've been saying Dennis, but it's Denise. So... Denise was questioning Dr. Mill's diagnosis of death by accidental drowning, and he's wondering about an autopsy. Well, the issue was moot anyway. The accident victim had left Martha's Vineyard at 9:30 a.m. Killen had not bothered to check with the undertaker, and so far neither a plane nor permission to take off had materialized. So Denise wants an autopsy, and actually her body is still at Edgartown Airport. They thought she had left, but the plane had never come. So she's still in the airport when he's wanting to do the autopsy. Dunn Gifford is there. You remember, he's the one who had gone and tried to be so helpful at all the different points, trying to get her body shepherded off the island. Well, that's still what he's doing, and he is concerned that there will be hold for autopsy put on the body. The undertaker assures him there's no such order. Well, the plane did not ultimately leave Edgartown until 12:30 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. Gifford had never met the Kopechnes. I just wanted to help them in any way I could. So this is Dunn Gifford, who is shepherding the body, but he had never even met the Kopechnes. David Burke was initially announced by the Kennedy people that he was going to be, quote, in charge of funeral arrangements. So imagine that. Ted Kennedy's administrative assistant, who was in D.C., he's the one supposedly announced that he's going to be in charge of funeral arrangements. Well, this evaporates into thin air, but it is noteworthy that he's initially announced to be the one to be in charge of that. The Kopechnes actually refused repeated offers by the Kennedy family to pay for the funeral. It says the money they had put aside for their daughter's wedding, Joseph Kopechne said, quote, we are using instead for her funeral, end quote. Oh. You guys, with his earlier comments about she wasn't engaged or anything like that, and then now this, you can just feel the progression of their grief. That they get the news, they get no details. The things that come out through the news, not through Ted Kennedy's mouth. And then, no, she wasn't even engaged. She wasn't dating anyone, nothing like that. And then now we're to the point of funeral plans. And they said, well, we had stashed this money away for her wedding, but now it'll go to her funeral. Oh, it's like heartbreaking. He says that they are going to have her buried in Plymouth, not in their hometown of Wilkes-Barre, because this is where her roots are, in Plymouth. Senator Kennedy telephoned on Sunday afternoon, Kopechne revealed. He said he wished he had died in the accident instead of Mary Jo. And I just wrote, well, we all do. The only silver lining of tragedies like these is that we're shaken out of our naiveness. We're shaken out of blind belief in people who hold power. That's the only silver lining of Mary Jo's death, is that it tells the truth about what powerful people are like. Her death is like a terrible black background that shows the precise brilliance of the stone that you're looking at if you're looking at a gem. And the gem that we're looking at is the vivid power of Ted Kennedy. And so the black, terrible background of her death reveals the precise occlusions and flaws in the gem of Ted Kennedy. We're wiser if we look at something like this and lean in to actually be willing to see the truth. But yeah, we all feel the lack of justice in a situation like this. That someone beautiful and lovely and young and full of potential, that her life was treated like trash by someone in power, by many people in power. Senator Kennedy calls Dr. Robert Watt that Sunday to let him know he was feeling better and didn't require him to make a house call. It's within a day of being up there at Hyannisport. Kennedy was reported despondent, in seclusion, refusing to be drawn out about the accident. In Gargan's view, quote, there was no prosecutable charge against Ted Kennedy for leaving the scene. All the law said you had to do was make it known you've had an accident. It doesn't say report it to the police, the fire department, or anyone else. All it says is you're to report it. The senator had not left the scene without reporting the accident because, quote, he made it known to me and Paul Markham that he was the driver of an automobile that, as far as he knew, had seriously injured a girl who was in the vehicle with him. And he brought us to the scene to make a serious rescue effort. This is Gargan's take. He does wrap up his little assessment by saying whether he should have taken a quicker action to rescue the girl or all those other factors, that's a different question. Thanks, Joey. Gargan thinks that the main thing that makes it different from an ordinary accident is that Ted Kennedy is involved. Though he felt like he gave the best advice to Ted Kennedy, he said, Ted didn't have to take my advice, and neither did anybody else. And as a matter of fact, they didn't take my advice in several respects. The question that must have been asked to Joey is, did anybody blame him in any way? Because we get this answer, quote, I don't know about blaming me for the accident and not reporting it, but some staff members, would-be friends, and others did try to indicate blame for me just having the party, the location of it, and other arrangements that led up to this disaster. They were saying things like, if it weren't for that damn Joey Gargan, this never would have happened. And they knew that that wasn't so. We had been going to Edgartown regattas and having parties for years and years. This was nothing new, except that the girls from Bobby's campaign were being entertained by me and the senator. But it wasn't just my party sort of to placate Joey. It was something everybody wanted to do. So that's Joey's answer about that. He says if he could eventually blame himself for anything, it was when he returned to the landing with Paul Markham the second time and did not swim across. He said, if I had dove into the water and followed the senator to Edgartown, things would have turned out differently. I didn't do that. The judgment I made at that time was a mistake. I agree. I agree with where he lands. I think if this is what happened, that is the time that he should have made a different decision. And I do want to say for all of us, it's easy to judge ourselves in hindsight. I have many situations in my life where I look back and I think, oh, I wish I would have gone on and had that conversation. I didn't know at the time how critical that would be. Or I wish I would have gone on and checked into this a little bit more with my teenager or whatever. And because later it grew into a bigger error. There's things we can all judge in hindsight. And even recently I was listening with the kids. We went on a backpacking trip, and on our way to and from, we listened to the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And at one point, Lucy, who is the youngest of the 4 Pevensey children, she's talking with Aslan. And there was a point where Aslan, who's kind of like the god figure in Chronicles of Narnia, he's a great lion, and he is telling her that she didn't listen to him at a previous point. And she talks about her fears and she talks about why she didn't. But ultimately she says, are you saying it would have turned out differently if I had listened to you? And he makes this wonderful point that I loved, and it's kind of stuck in my brain. He says, it's not given to you to know what would have been. And, that gives me peace as a mom, actually. And I hope it would for you too, that, yeah, we make errors. We're all human. We all make the wrong decision sometimes knowingly, and sometimes I think like Gargan, he was in the moment. If this is really what happened, he was balancing the shock of the accident, the need for somebody to help with the boiler room girls on the island. He was concerned that there's a bunch of drunk guys they don't know very well, and he's the only one who actually knows the boiler room girls very well. There's always the possibility that Joey is actively involved in a cover-up. But taking his words at face value, we all have things that we regret, having made one decision over another. And so to me, if he's telling the truth, then this would be the point where you could look back and say, yeah, I wish I would have made a different decision at that point. That would have all gone differently if I had. Gargan points out that at the Kennedy compound, it doesn't seem like anybody there knows that Ted was trying to blame the whole thing on Mary Jo. He thinks there's a misunderstanding even among the insiders, and that they're seeing him more honorably than he actually was. Had Burke Marshall been told the truth, Gargan suspected he would not have wanted anything to do with the case. However, there's no question that Dave Burke did know about the senator's reluctance, because he had said so at the ferry house. He didn't want to report the accident, and Burke was the one, you remember, who convinced him to go ahead and go to the Edgartown police. Burke suggested that Gargan should photograph the deep scratches on his chest and upper arms as evidence of the rescue effort that he had made at Dyke Bridge. But Gargan dismisses this idea. He says, as far as I was concerned, I was just a witness to a certain aspect of the accident. My injuries had no bearing on the case at all. Edward Hannafy sets Gargan straight on exactly what bearing it would have had on the matter. Because he was representing Ted Kennedy, Hannafy couldn't talk to him about the case, but he suggested that Gargan discuss this whole situation with a lawyer. Hannafy told Markham the same thing. You people are going to be highly criticized. I think you ought to protect yourselves. And this is good advice. He is giving them good legal advice. Go protect yourself. Make sure you're squared away. Don't let yourself get used and harmed by whatever Ted's going to say. And that's an ethical piece of advice he's giving them. Gargan failed to recognize the difficult position he and Markham were in until that point. Whatever advice they had given him after the accident, the senator did not want disclosed to anyone. Kennedy was invoking privileged communication to those two men because they were lawyers. So then they couldn't reveal what had happened on Chappaquiddick after the accident, they felt. By failing to report the accident, the senator had made Gargan and Markham unwitting accomplices in his effort to conceal it from the police for more than 9 hours. This involved them in a net of intrigue so as to avoid his own responsibility for the death of Mary Jo. And now he was invoking lawyer-client privilege to prevent them from telling anybody what they knew. Paul Markham was offended by the suggestion that he had acted as the senator's attorney. He said he had hardly participated in the discussion at all, merely seconding Gargan's reiterated insistence that the accident be reported immediately. And we all remember, too, that he was drunk at the time in the earlier interactions. Later that next morning, he was a part of things. But can the case be made that he was acting as a lawyer at 1 a.m. just because he got in the car when Ted Kennedy called him to the car? That seems like a stretch. Markham's advice had also not been sought at the police station. The senator had participated in lengthy telephone conferences with his staff while composing the statement, but Markham's advice had not been sought. So he's thinking, I can't be considered a lawyer in this situation. Gargan realizes, though, that the entire focus of the whole Kennedy compound is one thing: protecting the senator. They didn't care about Markham, Gargan, the girls, or anybody else at the party. They left us to fend for ourselves. So Gargan decides he's going to go to a man who he's known since childhood, a good friend of his father's, a high degree of respect for this man, called Joe Donahue. And Donahue agrees to meet Gargan the next day. Despite Hannafy's warning, Gargan didn't feel that he had any liability for the part that he had played in the accident. In fact, he says, I was rather proud of myself for what I had done under those particular circumstances. The scale of the disaster was brought home to Gargan when he made his way out of the compound. He recognizes Sylvia Wright of Life magazine and others from the AP and other members of the press. Now, they don't recognize him, but he knows who they are. And reporters are concentrating their expectations on the release of a statement that surely would come and further clarify what Senator Kennedy had experienced. Nothing's coming out, of course. Ted Kennedy expects to say nothing. A telegram sent by Senator Majority Mike Mansfield said this: deeply shocked and disturbed over tragedy which occurred over the weekend. What happened to you could have happened to any one of us. You have our full confidence, and if in any way I can be of assistance, please let me know. So that's Senate Majority Leader. You might not know about politics, but if you know the name Nancy Pelosi, it's because she was the Senate Majority Leader. That's the hugest position in the Senate. Ted Kennedy was the Majority Whip at this point, the number 2 to this Senate Majority Leader. So he's expressing full confidence. I just wrote, oh my, right out to the side of this, because he's like, hey, this could have happened to any of us, buddy. You have our full confidence. Let me know if you need anything, which is a lot. That's a lot for someone to say in this situation, to immediately assume the best about the situation. Mansfield had been prevailed upon to issue a sweeping and unqualified public endorsement of the senator's version of the accident. And he does. He says he's been going around with back brace for several years. I don't think this is going to affect the senator. They're human beings too. This could have happened to anybody of us. He says it would have been directly against his doctor's orders to dive repeatedly back into the accident. This could have contributed to his exhaustion and shock. It's It's quite understandable he might have been stunned and thus not known what he was doing for hours after the accident. Dick Drain, the aide in the senator's office, had no details about the incident, and he refuses to provide a guest list. He says there's, quote, at least 20 people who had attended the party. We know it's 12. There was, I think, quite a guest list in the beginning. Ethel Kennedy releases a statement, quote, Mary Jo was a sweet, wonderful girl. She worked for Bobby for years, and she was in the boiler room, the phone room used for delegate counts during the campaign. Only the great ones worked there, and she was just terrific. She often came out to the house, and she was the one who stayed up all night typing Bobby's speech on Vietnam. She was a wonderful person, end quote. This statement provoked ripples of derision from the information-starved reporters at the barricade. She hadn't even acknowledged that an accident had occurred. She hadn't mentioned that Mary Jo had been killed or that her brother-in-law was the one driving the accident car. It mentioned nothing. One reporter said that statement was patronizing as hell. Typing was the operative word to signify that Mary Jo had been devoted in service to the Kennedys. It was like giving her a posthumous pat on the head. No amount of public relations was going to get around the fact that Mary Jo Kopechne had died in Ted Kennedy's car, and he had taken 10 hours to tell the police about it. That boils the story down to its simplest truth, doesn't it? And that was all done by journalist Nancy Cummings, one of the few women on the scene. She boiled it down to its essence rather quickly. She went on, this tragedy more properly belonged to the Kopechne family. It was not the Kennedy crisis. This was a Kopechne tragedy. The Kennedy apparatus, so skilled at manipulating the media, was losing its sure and practiced grip on the press, which had played so large a part in their political ascendancy. The list of questions the New York Times had sent in received no response. Security police were used to relay to reporters that Senator Kennedy had, quote, nothing further to say about the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. Speculation begins to mount, and of course it does, because they're getting no answers. I do think that this part about this is a key truth that this book shows, that the Kennedy apparatus, so skilled at manipulating the media, was losing its grip on the press. This is good. This is the turning of an important page in history, that they're not able to pull all the strings anymore. They're trying to pull the strings they can, but there's too many people digging. And this is what journalism is and ought to be. This is what it ought to be now. Whether you're talking about Trump, Biden, Kamala, Pelosi, whoever you're talking about, when there is a scandal, journalists ought to be the ones digging and asking the hard questions. They ought to be the ones noticing when there is obfuscation, when there's a lack of information coming out, when there's just nonsense statements coming out. They should be the ones not to parrot the statement, but to look at the statement and evaluate it for what it is. And right now we tend to have a journalistic class that simply reads the talking points and presents them as fact and never questions them. I think independent journalism is making some headway in this problem, but it's still a problem. This, however, was an important time period in history where it was going from the Kennedys can kind of shut things up to no matter what, we're going to dig, we're going to ask questions, even if it's inconvenient. The initial newspaper reports had been sympathetic. The Globe described the senator as, quote, the only surviving brother, end quote. The New York Times referenced, quote, the doom-haunted Kennedy family, end quote. Curiously, the Times failed to acknowledge the major contribution made to its coverage by James Reston. Remember, he was on the case. When he was returning a rental car to a garage in Falmouth, Reston was asked by the owner, Alvin Nickerson, what's going on over in Edgartown? Reston replied, I'd love to tell the story, but they won't let me, end quote. Other Timesmen had been sent in to cover the accident. So, I do want to say, even on the heels of all of that, yes, things are starting to spiral outside of the Kennedys' control, but not entirely. And this little pocket of information from James Reston reminded me of Amy Robach. Do you remember when she had the Epstein story? And one of the cameramen in the kind of after rolling of the camera, got her on camera saying, I had it all. I had everything. We had all the information we need, and I was just waiting for the higher-ups to let me release the report, and it was killed. And this was well before anything about Epstein had come out. So there are times when the higher-ups in news agencies kill stories for whatever reasons they have. It happened then, it happens now. The photo, you remember, we'll put it up here, by Harvey Ewing that he thought was unsatisfactory, captured the senator in mid-stride, looking fit and trim. Graphic evidence that at 9:45 a.m. Saturday morning, Ted Kennedy was neither in a state of shock or exhaustion. He didn't appear to have suffered any significant injury as a result of the accident. So Ewing served all of us by taking that photo. Even though it's an unsatisfactory photo, it helped all of us. Senator Kennedy spent the better part of Sunday with members of his staff preparing a formal statement to the press about the accident, but at the last minute, a decision was made to withhold comment. By the time Doug Gifford got back from Pennsylvania, he saw Ted Kennedy and he said, quote, he was in a state of mind I'd never quite seen in him before, down but determined. He wanted to make a statement, go to court, and get the whole thing settled right then. So my observations for Chapter 16 are the DA would have urged an autopsy, but the miscommunications among authority figures ill-served Mary Jo Kopechne, and the autopsy was not done. Kennedy adjacent people are shoving in to try to manhandle the Kopechnes. We've got Gifford with the body, David Burke with funeral arrangements, and the Kennedys trying to insist on using their money. But the Kopechnes stiff-arm these offers. They use Mary Jo's wedding money for her funeral. Ted Kennedy is feeling better. He says he doesn't need the doctor's care just 24 to 36 hours later, which I'll point out is often the time when our injuries start to show up from something like this. If you've ever been skiing and fallen, or tripped and hiked or twisted your ankle, 24 to 36 hours is when injuries start to flare up and start to actually feel their full effect. So for him to say he's already feeling better just doesn't fit with having been in a serious accident. Some in the Kennedy compound know the actual story, some do not. Argan reaches out for a personal lawyer, that's important, and the Senate machine is grinding for Ted Kennedy. Ethel's statement comes out without any mention of the facts. Some journalists see the truth, and some are bold enough to say the truth. Those are my observations for 16. I think let's go ahead and get into Chapter 17, and then we'll be done for this week. Jimmy Smith spent Sunday morning watching the moon landing on television, reading newspaper accounts of the Kennedy accident, and reflecting on his own invitation to the now famous cookout at Chappaquiddick. When Gargan had invited him to the cookout, he said a cookout had been planned for the girls who worked for Robert Kennedy. Quote, if you're in Edgartown for the regatta, drop by and see us, end quote. The invitation was given in the spirit of having something to eat after the races with the same old crowd that had something in common. A lot of people who held Bobby in high regard suffered a personal crisis when he was killed. There was an awful sense of loss. So these gatherings were a chance for people who had had a similar experience to get together, like a reunion of guys that had been in battle. But Smith declined the invitation. Saturday, July 19th was his wedding anniversary, and he was taking his wife out to dinner. Besides, he only knew one of the Boiler Room girls. Her name was Mary Jo Kopechne. He had been the campaign coordinator for Allegheny County in western Pennsylvania in '68, and he had maintained daily telephone contact with Robert Kennedy for President headquarters in Washington, where a half dozen young women compiled detailed intelligence in black loose-leaf notebooks of the states. Mary Jo Kopechne had been, quote, in charge of Pennsylvania. Smith had talked to her almost every day. To refer to her as a secretary, however, was to misrepresent the work of the Boiler Room. The importance of the work was in fact the subject of a memorandum that Smith had received during the campaign. This memo was from an assistant to Kenny O'Donnell, and it said, as we all know, the above states have been described in the press as the crucial battleground for the August convention. Attempting to compile information on each of the delegates or potential delegates, they had gotten together information. They said, as soon as possible, please send this information. Phone numbers, age, occupation, marital status, etc., etc. Their feelings about RFK, what or who will most influence his vote, what advice you can submit to the candidate or to us to assist you in influencing the vote, etc. This list of names and any pertinent information can be updated to us by daily memo or at your convenience. They give the address. It says all of the above information should be submitted to us or to the girls in the boiler room who are maintaining the delegate files. They, in turn, will keep us informed. The boiler room was also the conduit for policy statements. So not only were they compiling information about Electoral College delegates, but they were also the conduit for policy statements about what RFK's policies were on various different topics. So the boiler room would compose entire lists of position papers about where Kennedy stood on various issues. Mary Jo told Smith about these papers. It's suggested that you use whichever one you feel best for your state or not use any at all. So they would provide, here's all the things you could say to your people. Here are the things that RFK believes. Any of this that you want to use, go ahead and use it to try to get the delegates on board for RFK. But they wanted to be able to take the delegates to their side and to make sure that the delegates were locked in and solid on voting for RFK. When Smith called New Bedford on Sunday afternoon, he reached Denise's mother, with whom the bachelor DA lived. Mrs. Denise was praying for Rose Kennedy, she said. That poor woman, my heart goes out to her. She's been through so much. However, Mrs. Denise found the silence from the Kennedy compound about the accident puzzling. Why don't they just come out and tell the truth? To Smith, Mrs. Denise confided the results of a blood alcohol test that had been telephoned to her son by state police chemists in Boston. The results showed that Mary Jo Kopechne had been, quote, drunk at the time of her death. So then, when he talks to Denise the next time, he had worked himself into such a state of anxiety, he launched into a furious defense of Ted Kennedy to Edmund Denise. Don't forget the guy got hit in the head. He's got a bad back. He was in pain. If he laid low for a while and said, oh no, my God, again, this has happened, meaning another disaster, put yourself in his place. Everyone in the U.S. had been affected by the deaths of John and Robert Kennedy, Smith said. How would it be if they were both your brothers? And having your father upstairs not right? I just think the guy's been through so much. I feel sorry for him, Denise said. And he dismissed newspaper accounts beginning to question gaps in the senator's report of the accident. What's all this business about a conflicting statement? That's nothing. Never mind the press. Never mind being president. Let's save him. That's Denise's statement to Smith. So Smith and Denise, Smith, a campaign surrogate, and Denise, who's the DA, are now talking. And he says, let's save him. Denise says, you get a hold of Ted Kennedy. You tell him I'm not going to prosecute him. I want to stay out of it. Denise had a message that he wished Smith to deliver. Quote, from me through you to Ted and nobody else. I won't touch this case unless Ted wants me to. End quote. That's where chapter 17 leaves it. So the observations from chapter 17, even though it's short, are Smith had been invited to the cookout. He was one of these that had been like, hey, if you want to come by. Mary Jo and other boiler room girls were doing shrewd research on behalf of RFK's campaign. They were preparing talking point memos and position papers and interfacing with those who were influencing delegates across the nation. Mary Jo's blood alcohol level, according to Denise's mother, was drunk at the time of the accident. Smith is now passionately defending Ted Kennedy, which is what you'd expect for somebody who was a Kennedy guy. The DA says, I feel sorry for him. Never mind the press. Let's save him. I want to stay out of it. And then the moon landing is happening alongside Chappaquiddick at the very same hours. You've got this massive story about the Kennedys. And yet, even though this is massive, it's like at a level 9, but the level 10 is the moon, right? That's the big story. So it makes sense why it was kind of off to the side with the Kennedy story, and yet the Kennedy story was still a big deal. So we learned a lot in these chapters. We got through 3 this time. My goal was actually 4, but at least we got through 3. We're getting a little faster maybe, and the next few chapters actually are like that. They're a bit shorter, and I think we can move through them a little more quickly. So perhaps we can do 3 or 4 at a time. I hope you guys have a great week. I hope you'll check out the other books that we're starting this week. If you made it to the end of the video and you are not yet subscribed, go ahead and click that button, please. I'll see you next time.